Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the My NHPCO Education Research Academics Community Chat. Soul injury, liberating unmourned loss, hurt, and unforgiven guilt and shame. And now Kathy Emmett will introduce our presenter.
Thanks very much, Becca. Yes, this is Kathy Emmett. I am the section leader for the My NHPCO Education Research and Academics section. And we welcome you all here today, whether you're a member of our section or joining us from another section. We're excited for our speaker, but I just wanted to do a few little housekeeping details first. Our next chat is scheduled for June the 16th. Our section holds our chats on the third Tuesday every other month. And at this point in time, I'm planning on having our section report out our survey results. We did a survey of our community the past month. Maybe not surprisingly, we didn't have a lot of participation in the survey because I think a lot of people have a lot of other things going on in this COVID era, the pandemic that we're living in. And so we're planning to briefly go over the survey results, but I think we'll also use our chat in June as a time for us to share lessons learned in our section during this pandemic time. I know our organization has had to have a crash course in online learning, online onboarding, Zoom meetings, and so I'd be interested to hear from others as well. So we'll devote our time in June to both the survey results of our section and then also sharing and learning from each other. As I said today, we are very, very excited to have Deborah Grassman, the founder of Opus Peace, a nurse practitioner, formerly with the VA. She has been a national author and speaker for many, many years. And probably some of you on this call or on the call today because you've had the opportunity to hear her speak in the past and maybe have been very inspired. And one of our VPs actually stopped by my office this morning. He knew Deborah was going to be talking this afternoon in our community, and he said that he always loves to listen to Deborah because he always learns something new every time. And so without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Deborah.
Well, thank you so much, Becca and Kathy, and I hope to fulfill that. In other words, bring you some information that may be new for you. But I truly appreciate that you want to hear about soul injury, and my hope is that the information you gain today will influence your professional life and also will influence your personal life. And I've also even included information about how this relates to the pandemic. So for many of you, if you've been doing hospice work like I have for more than 25 years, you have been with thousands of people who have died. And what's unusual, I think, about the perspective that I sometimes bring that others don't know, even hospice people, is that in my 30-year career at the VA doing hospice work, I took care of more than 10,000 dying veterans. And so that perspective about trauma, that perspective about veterans at the end of life is sometimes what I can bring to the plate, so to speak, that might be a little bit different. Okay, how did I get there? We go. So, all right. So what you see on your screen right now are the 5 VA hospice nurses who started Opus Peace. And what we witnessed with those 10,000 dying veterans is providing lessons for the rest of the world, we believe. Those lessons are about a process for attaining personal peace. And ironically, these lessons have come from people who were trained for war. So these veterans showed us a wound that lurked in their souls. It was a wound that was different than the PTSD that many of them had. It was even different in some ways than the moral injury that some of our veterans suffer. Sometimes our veterans called it a soul injury. And the lessons that they taught us were so profound that that was why we started this nonprofit that we call Opus Peace, so that we could bring their message to the rest of the world and bring that message to people who are not dying and people who are not veterans. Now, at first glance, it may seem odd that this phenomena of soul injury is emerging out of the hospice field, but I am so proud that it is. I hope that you are proud that it is emerging out of the hospice field, because it can be extrapolated upstream to, as I said, non-dying, and show us how to live with peace as well. Because as you all well know, dying people know things that the rest of us do not. Because perspectives shift dramatically as death approaches. You know, the day before a person's given a terminal diagnosis, they take their life for granted. The day after they're given a terminal diagnosis, they wake up. Things that didn't seem important yesterday suddenly seem urgent to complete. And things we thought were so important fade in importance. So that is the gift that death is. It awakens us to how our life matters. So the soul injury concept provides a non-pathologized term to describe a phenomenon in everyday language with practical applications. So what you might discover in using this term is that soul injuries are at the core of those end-of-life scenarios where patient-family satisfaction is not quite met. You know these kinds of scenarios. Effective pain control was not quite achieved despite aggressive intervention. Agitation that does not yield to our usual medication regimens. And multi-layered family dynamics that are often such a challenge and sometimes interfere with patients and their families achieving the goal of peace that we want for them. So let's look more closely at this concept about soul injury before we review a tool that will open the door to meaningful conversations. So we define soul injury as a wound to our sense of self, our real self that is beyond the facade. It's a wound that stifles full potential because it separates a person from who they are meant to be. Now, sometimes these wounds accompany trauma, but more often they occur insidiously, gradually occurring over time. They're like slow leaks that cause us to become disconnected to our sense of self. Maybe you can identify with this. Have there been times in your own life when you felt lost, maybe forgot who you really were, and you started putting on facades to try to become someone else? That is often how we start acquiring a soul injury. I'm going to show you a 2.5-minute video of 4 people who will tell you how they acquired their soul injury.
As I was experiencing Vietnam and working in the OR and being a medic, I realized after the fact that I was constantly filling myself with pain and sorrow. And I feel as though part of the reason why my soul left me is because there wasn't any room. I was full of sorrow. I had a soul injury.
So I remember when I was 7 years old thinking that I wish that I could have saved my grandparents from their horrible death so that my parents would not be in such pain. course, this was an irrational guilt because I wasn't even born when my grandparents were killed. And yet I felt this helplessness with respect to my parents' pain and the generational soul injury that incurred in my family was passed on from one generation to another onto me, and hopefully not onto the next generation.
I attended a pretty well-known Christian university, and one of the fundraisers was to have people, this particular club, social club, painted themselves black, charcoal, and had a slave auction in front of the cafeteria. And just the nauseating feeling that came from that in 1968, I know the civil rights movement was still in its throes, but that in a Christian community that was tolerated. And throughout my career since that time, what could have been so debilitating and self-destructive, even though I felt the trauma, it has given me a new approach to helping people who have been wounded or who have suffered soul injury through racism, marginalization, bigotry, and prejudice.
So I want to tell you about soul injury from the perspective of being a nurse for 38 years. The language, the principles of soul injury actually named for me something that I've been aware of for many years, and that's this incredible burden or sense of perfectionism.
So you can see how these 4 people that you just saw acquired their soul injuries in different ways, but there are patterns of symptoms that they often have in common, such as becoming disconnected from their own sense of inner goodness and beauty, a sense of emptiness, maybe a loss of meaning and a sense that they don't matter, a sense that a part of self is missing or is defective, unlovable, or is a failure. And often when you peel back the layers of a soul injury, you will often find a sense of betrayal. And that betrayal can come from many different sources that you see listed up on your screen. Now, just to give you a personal example, you see on your screen a picture of myself when I was 5 years old. And I'm watching Lassie on television. That was my favorite TV show. And she was in a dangerous situation. And I'm crying because I'm sure she's going to die. And right then, my dad walks through the room. And he laughs at my tears. Now, what do you think I did? I made a 5-year-old decision that day to never cry again. And I didn't for 30 years. I became ashamed of that part of me that felt sad. But when I was 35 and I was dealing with a painful situation, it occurred to me, what if my fear of pain is worse than if I just let myself feel it? And that's when my unfreezing began. That's when I started becoming real. Now, I'm almost embarrassed to tell you that story because it seems so trivial when you think of what I have witnessed on veterans' deathbeds. But I will tell you that there are lots of different ways to forget who you really are. But you will arrive at the same lifeless, soulless place. We can come to that place suddenly after trauma or gradually, insidiously corroding our sense of self. The other point I just want to make before I leave this slide is, I had a very loving father. He meant no mal harm to me. And if he would have known that his rather insensitive remark, I guess, would have had that type of impression on me, he never would have said it. And the reason I think that point is important is because we can make assumptions that soul injuries occur after really adverse events, when often that is not the case, especially when these things happen in childhood and we interpret them that way. Well, what causes soul injuries? Well, what 10,000 dying veterans, as well as people like the 4 people you saw in that previous video, have taught us is that soul injuries are caused by unmourned loss and hurt, unforgiven guilt and shame, and diminished self-compassion. Yet, we are not taught how to lose. We're not taught how to mourn or how to forgive or how to compassionately listen to our deepest self. Our educational systems value achievement and success. They teach us how to hold on to, how to control. So we don't value learning how to mourn losses and hurts. We are not taught how to use self-compassion to transform shame. And instead, we are often taught to numb out feelings of hurt, shame, and guilt. So these are some numbing agents that we often use that keeps us disconnected from the part of ourself carrying our emotional pain. And this is just a small list. There's lots of more. But what's important is that you know what numbing agents you use so that you can bring awareness. You can be mindful about the ways that you are keeping yourself unconscious. Now, you all as a hospice audience well know that when people begin to face the end of their life, they often look back on their lives and they will voice regrets. They look back with a broader perspective and they see things that they could have done differently. And almost always what I noticed was that their regrets almost always were associated with how they misused their numbing agents. They used numbing agents to separate them from other people who loved them and separated them from their own sense of self. So what you'll find is that we all have tactics to cover up or camouflage our pain. Now, is camouflage important in untrustworthy environments? Yes. But what's the problem? We often end up wearing our camo at home with ourselves and with others who are trustworthy. Well, where does all that lead? Well, we end up selling our soul, so to speak. There's a famous psychiatrist, Milton Erickson, who said this: once the log jam is opened, the river flows again. So what if we already have everything we need in order to be whole? What if it's not a matter of trying to put more positive wholeness in, but rather clearing the barriers that keep us from accessing wholeness that's already there? What if unmourned loss and hurt is a barrier that is preventing access to the energy of our deepest self? That it's not about trying to put more water in that river. It's not about trying to make that river run faster. Because if we could truly realize this, we would stop being so afraid of loss, hurt, and guilt. And instead, we'd learn how to mourn and how to forgive so we could release its hurt. And we would stop using numbing agents to try to not feel uncomfortable feelings. Let me tell you what a hospice medical director who heard this talk on soul injury at an NHPCO conference that I was speaking at last year. And this is what he said. He said, we use a red, yellow, green triage system for symptom management. Red equals symptoms that are out of control, and green is symptoms under control, and yellow's in between. He said, when I heard you talk, I realized that after we get our patients into the green zone, that's not enough. There's something more. And I realized that day that something more is soul injury. So that physician now values soul injury, and he said he uses that term at their team meetings to address it. So the goal in my mind of hospice care is not symptom management. Symptom management is simply an essential vehicle to achieve the goal of healing. Dying people are fertile ground for healing. I guarantee you, if I told you you only had a day, a week, a month, a year to live, that your life would change dramatically. Your priorities would shift dramatically. And often there is a lot of healing that then occurs. And what I would say is responding to soul injury is the essential vehicle to achieve that goal of healing. And it starts with a conversation. I always say, you only get to die once. Don't miss the opportunity to be present. The soul injury inventory that I'm going to show you helps people to let go of fear and denial so they can be present for the mystery of their own death. So as I want to acquaint you now with this self-awareness inventory, I do not suggest that this tool alone is a magic cure, but I will tell you that I have used this tool and I have found that being equipped with this skill set and knowledge to recognize and respond to soul injuries can help guide patients and families toward meaningful living while they are dying. And implementing this tool also increases the chances that unfinished business is completed, which certainly also helps bereavement recovery for the families. So you are going to find that just the term soul injury will provide you with a way to initiate a conversation about the hurts that our patients have experienced and to describe it in everyday language that is not threatening and in fact invites vulnerability. So just to tell you a little bit about how this evolved, when we started our inpatient hospice unit at the VA where I was the nurse practitioner. I would do all the consults around the hospital and also see our patients on our own unit. And that was all worked out really well for the first couple of years. But business kept picking up, and we weren't getting any more FTE for our program. So you can imagine, I'm sure it's for many of you, it's your life too. I started working faster and harder and longer, day after day. And of course, that started leading to burnout. One day I saw an advertisement for a position that I was qualified for in another area of the hospital, and I was sort of interested in that field at any rate. And so I went to my boss and I told her that I was going to apply for this other job. And she looked at me and she said, "You can't leave hospice. Hospice is your passion. You do not want to leave your passion." So I remember walking back to my office. I kept pondering what she said, trying to think about what I could do differently so that I could stay in this field that I loved. And what I realized was I needed to learn, because I was doing about 6 to 8 consults a day with new patients, in addition to the patients on our own unit. So what I realized was, if I could figure out a way to kind of open the conversation in a short visit, introduce myself, leave something behind, and then come back later in the day or the next day, maybe I could get to the bottom line faster. So that's sort of how this originated. So, hold on. Okay. So the whole purpose in developing it was so I could get to the bottom line faster, so that I could go home sooner than 6 p.m. every night and come in later than 6 a.m. every day. But what I did find was what I was learning, what the patients were teaching me, was really how to craft questions and develop some tools that I could leave behind that would foster conversations with not only among themselves, but with their loved ones as well. The other thing that we have now entered into is establishing metrics that validate the relevance of the soul injury phenomena. We are working with Wright State University Medical School to do some of that research, and Johns Hopkins is getting ready to publish a textbook, and they are publishing some of our research findings with soul injury. So. All right, so I want to give you just a very broad view, and then I'm going to go through each question individually so you can kind of see how to apply it. But in general, these are the first 4 questions, and you can see it's just a very simple Likert scale of 1 to 4 to measure the responses. And yes, we often got patients way too late for them to be able to answer these questions. But nevertheless, we found that this was very helpful to give it to the family and ask them to provide an answer that they thought the patient would say. And so still a meaningful conversation among family members often occurred, and that often helped with bereavement care. So let's go over each one individually. The first question is, I am not able to be my real self. You can see that's the core definition of a soul injury. And what that does is it invites dialogue about facades, self-betrayal, expectations from others, appearances, lost dreams, unfinished business. And as a hospice audience, I think you can appreciate that these kinds of conversations are so relevant, so important, and meaningful. The other thing I would say is, can you appreciate how these conversations, or lack of having the conversation, could affect the peaceful dying process that we providers really are wanting to provide? So the second question says, I engage in some activities to help me avoid uncomfortable feelings. So this question invites us to look at our fear of uncomfortable feelings. And, you know, if you think about it, although emotional distress is often talked about, fear of emotional distress is often overlooked. And it is the fear of feeling uncomfortable feelings that causes those feelings to get covered up and hidden. It is the fear of experiencing the pain and the hurt that is at the root of utilizing numbing behaviors. So the fear often means that these feelings are threatening and they provoke defensiveness if confronted. But this tool, what I have found, is a way to uncover the fear in a non-threatening manner that often will bring insight. Question number 3 is, when I avoid uncomfortable feelings, it often causes problems with people in my life. So certainly we know that avoiding uncomfortable feelings impacts relationships. You know, how fear of emotional distress impacts relationships is something that many people never thought about. In fact, people sometimes think that avoiding negative feelings is desired. It's the way to be happy. So oftentimes this contributes to shallow relationships that lack intimacy. Yet at the end of life, the impact of avoidance of negative feelings almost always unwillingly surfaces. For example, you all have heard me talk about those unresolved burdens of combat veterans, burdens and memories that often surface unbidden at the end of life because people's conscious mind starts receding at the end of life and their unconscious mind starts expanding. And that's oftentimes when these things surface. So think about suspecting an unresolved soul injury if a patient continues to be agitated or complains of pain, even though you're doing extensive pain control management. Question number 4 is, I have a hard time facing loss, change, disappointments, or transitions. Losses, changes, and transitions are fraught with uncertainty, with loss of control, and with unknowns. And again, we haven't been taught how to navigate change, how to let ourselves experience disappointments and failures. So these can be very threatening. Certainly, death is the greatest transition and loss of control that any of us will experience. So if someone already has a difficult time facing loss and change and transitions, then we can anticipate that that person might be at higher risk for complicated dying. Question number 5 is, guilt and or shame haunt me. Oftentimes that brings to possibilities, conversations about forgiveness and how to seek and extend forgiveness. Let me tell you how one patient used this inventory. She first took it for herself, and then later she got a blank one and she met with her adult daughter. And this is what she said to her daughter. She said, I'd like you to take this inventory, and afterward, let's talk about how my alcoholism caused a soul injury in you when you were a child. Wow. Can you imagine the healing that occurred and the effect that this had on this woman's death? This woman told us that her relationship with her daughter totally changed because there was no more fear and they were both open to talking about their hurtful past. And likewise, can you imagine the challenges that could have presented had this healing not occurred? So again, this tool opens doors. It opens doors in non-threatening ways that facilitates meaningful conversations that can, in fact, restore wholeness. Question 6 says, I feel defective, inadequate, or unworthy. And this question often prompts stories of not being good enough, not being pretty enough, strong enough, giving enough, and on and on. Those stories that often haunt us and often undermine our sense of self, especially at the end of life. I mean, I can think of several patients that felt like they were not good enough to get into heaven. So these soul injuries, again, often surface at the end of life. I remember one patient who said to me that he didn't think he was going to make it into heaven because he had, quote unquote, pissed on a priest's grave. And so I asked him what had precipitated that. And he then told me that he had been molested by this priest when he was a child. And so I responded to him. I said, well, I believe he deserved that. That man had told me that story without ever looking in my eyes, had his head kind of turned away. And when I said that, he turned and looked in my eyes and he said, do you really mean that? I said, yeah, I really mean that. I said, I'm glad that kid finally was able to express what should not have been done to him. I'm glad that man took something very precious away from you. He stole something very precious from you. I'm glad that you were able to speak up and speak up to him. So again, you could so see the relief because he had been worried about, because he had done that, whether or not he would get into heaven. Question 7, self-compassion is difficult for me. Let me just tell you briefly a little bit about the brain, because as practitioners, we need to understand how the sense of self is achieved to understand the ramifications of an unresolved soul injury. Because self-compassion starts with achieving a sense of self. So I'd like to introduce you to a book written by a psychiatrist, Bessel van der Kolk. He has devoted his career to responding to people who've been traumatized. He's one of the leading authorities on PTSD. He has the Center for Trauma in Boston. And Dr. van der Kolk writes about the area of the brain that gives us a sense of self. So I'm just going to give you the highlights in a very brief way. But he says that if we look at a cross section, a central section of the brain, we would see these brain structures that you see listed on the slide. And their names aren't really important for what we're discussing, but what is important is that these parts of the brain are responsible for giving us a sense of self. This is the part of the brain that registers sensations. And when these structures are not activated, then this part of the brain has difficulty interpreting and assessing the significance of internal sensations. Now at Opus Peace, we call this the me brain because it gives us a sense of me. But when somebody experiences trauma like we see in PTSD, brain scans show a markedly lower activity in this central corridor of the brain, which means that the person can't feel or evaluate their personal sensations because they have numbed those sensations out. And that in turn means that there is an interruption in their ability to achieve a sense of self, a sense of me. In other words, a soul injury. So Van der Kolk essentially says that to heal, we have to do a couple of things. First of all, we have to tone down the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that does the fight or flight freeze part. And we have to learn how to activate this portion of the me brain. And the other part of his research, I think that is so interesting, is that kids with early trauma or neglect have almost no activation of that central portion of the brain. On the other hand, people who meditate daily, their brain scans, this part of the brain, lights up. So this question number 7 about self-compassion offers an opportunity for our patients to explore ways to self-validate and activate this part of the brain. The last question says, I struggle to find meaning in my life. So opportunities to seek and uncover purpose, as all of us know doing hospice care, this often surfaces in a very natural way at the end of life. Kind of that life review process happens as memories surface almost automatically. And also family members often visit, they review memories of their time together. And in the stories that surface, that's where we find the meaning. So life review really helps people develop the insight to better understand the meaning of their lives, especially if the family is participating in that life review process. And people's stories often surface at the end of life. They're often those untold stories. How many times have you listened to a patient's story and the family sitting there and they go, I didn't know that. He never said anything to me about that, those types of things. Now I do, when I'm talking about untold stories, they're often untold stories of trauma that will surface at the end of life. I just want to remind everybody, as I have in previous presentations, do not push people to tell their stories of trauma. I think we do damage when we do that. And I also think we do damage if we don't know how to create a safe emotional environment so the story can come forth if they so choose, because that is called abandonment. So very briefly, the scoring, you can just see that the lower the score, the more likely there is to be issues of loss, hurt, grief, guilt, and shame. And that often leads to unfinished business, attachments that might complicate peaceful dying or could complicate peaceful bereavement recovery. So this is a picture of our webpage that I would encourage you to go to later, and you can see up in the top right-hand box, you can take the inventory. I've also passed those the inventory on for your handouts that you can download off the NHPCO website. So I want to finish up in these last 15, 20 minutes of it. Now that you know a bit about soul injury, I want to contrast it with moral injury and PTSD. And the reason why this is important is because the treatments differ. And not only that, but I have often found that there's often a dual diagnosis. PTSD and or moral injury can often cause a soul injury, and vice versa. Now, what I'm going to be going over with you, I've provided a chart that you can, again, download so that you can have all this in front of you later as I briefly go over this. So you already heard about the definition of soul injury being a wound to our sense of self. Moral injury is defined by the Department of Defense and the VA as a violation of deepest held beliefs and expectations, causing moral confusion. And PTSD is defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as a mental health issue that some people develop after experiencing or witnessing a life-threatening event such as combat, a natural disaster, car accident, or sexual assault. Now, soul injury, as you already heard, impacts a person's sense of self and their personhood. Moral injury impacts a person's beliefs and value systems, which end up separating them from a sense of trust in others or even themselves if they were the one that committed the moral injury. And PTSD, the research basically shows that it primarily impacts a person's brain, especially the amygdala, which is that fight, flight, freeze part of the brain, and that the fear-based brain keeps them from feeling safe in the world. Soul injury, you already heard, is caused by unmourned loss and hurt, unforgiven guilt and shame, and diminished self-compassion. Moral injury is caused by situations when there's not a clear right and wrong. It's not black and white. It can involve trusting people with power who fail to do the right thing. And it can also involve surviving, just trying to survive, but doing sometimes it in ways that violates personal consciousness. Now, certainly I have seen this in veterans and combat veterans sometimes who are in kill or be killed situations, and now they come many years later to the end of their life and they harbor this moral injury, and they would tell me sometimes the things that they had done when they were in a situation where they were about to be killed, but they end up judging themselves as if they were not in that situation, so to speak, in a kill or be killed situation, so to speak. So again, when someone's getting ready to meet their maker, so to speak, it's not unusual for moral injuries to surface at that time. Again, the DSM would say that PTSD is caused by either direct experience of trauma or witnessing it or even learning about it when someone you love was traumatized. So let me just give you some examples. So think about soul injury just being called names when you were a child, and if you incorporate that label into your identity and grow up thinking those, whatever it might name you were called, that can cause a soul injury. Been surprised at how many birth issues. So say you're a girl with parents who wanted a boy and regularly reminded you of that, or if you're not the favorite sibling, or you're born with a parent who abandoned them, or born with the wrong, quote unquote, wrong sexual orientation, or being adopted, those types of things can often cause identity issues. Just young adults maybe who can't get launched, or older adults with a midlife crisis or loss of dreams. Just a lot of times life transitions will cause people to feel lost or forgotten, say after divorce or the death of a loved one, or retirement, layoff from a job. Perfectionism, again, thinking about how perfectionism is trying to prove that one is quote unquote good enough. Snobbish behaviors, or its opposite, bullying behaviors, really originate in feelings of superiority. And it having a mental health issue, and then as a result of that mental health issue, thinking that you must be worthless or defective or inadequate. And think about elderly people who often feel useless, they don't feel productive anymore, and they often feel invisible. All of this might cause a soul injury. So moral injury can be seen with military combatants who have accidentally or intentionally killed someone, especially if that someone was a child or a civilian sometimes. A military combatant betrayed by his or her country. Certainly we see that with our Vietnam veterans. Moral injuries can be, lying, altering testimony, kind of to save your own skin, or being a victim of being falsely accused on the other end. Maybe not protecting or standing up for someone. Abortion. I've certainly heard some of these types of stories at the end of life. So say a woman aborts a pregnancy in spite of her religious beliefs, or a man with certain religious beliefs unable to stop an abortion. That can surface as a moral injury. Victims of crime, also perpetrators of crime, if they have remorse, will and feel badly about it, will experience moral injury. A supervisor who lays off good, loyal workers to meet fiscal responsibilities. I have this highlighted in yellow because with the current pandemic, I just heard a story just this past week from someone that when the CEO had to come before the staff and talk about laying off staff, that he was actually crying as he said it. So feeling that moral obligation. Certainly this one, a healthcare worker who has to slight patient care due to understaffing or having no supplies. So when we think about our healthcare workers, our hospice workers right now, they are at risk for moral injury because of these very factors. So PTSD, again, the DSM would talk about combat, sexual assault, kidnapping, terrorist attack, torture, POW, man-made disasters, severe auto accidents, terminal diagnosis. All of these can precipitate PTSD. And I know I've done presentations with you all on PTSD, especially at the end of life, and those are still available on the, I believe, on the We Honor Veterans website that you can get in detail. So I just want to give you an example that might help to clarify these three. I want to introduce you to John Drinkard. He is a Marine Corps veteran who has studied and lived soul injury, moral injury, and PTSD. And in speaking to an audience of hospice workers, I want to just share with you what he said that day. This is what he said. I could tell you about the 3 helicopter crashes I was in and the PTSD I have suffered after Vietnam, but I won't, because PTSD treatments have taught me how to manage my triggers and calm my mind. I could tell you about the moral injury I suffered because I felt betrayed by my country. I had joined the Marine Corps to go to Vietnam and fight for God and country. When I got there, I discovered there was no God and there was no country in that war. It was all a bright, shining lie. But working with a group of other veterans who also had moral injury helped me release my bitterness. If I was dying, and if you came to visit me, the issue that might surprise you is my quote-unquote father wound, a wound that occurred when I was 9 years old. I had just been discharged from the hospital with a diagnosis of an enlarged heart. On the way home, my dad stopped to socialize with a friend. I told him I didn't feel good and I wanted to go home. My father berated me for expressing my needs, completely devaluing and degrading me. The John I knew disappeared that day. The loss of self and the shame I felt from my father's onslaught created an insidious soul injury that was much greater than the enlarged heart I had just suffered. That incident does not meet the criteria for PTSD nor moral injury. It does meet the criteria for soul injury, a wound I had buried alive because it paled in comparison to all the other traumas I experienced in the war. In my 70s, I learned about soul injury and how to grieve the losses of that 9-year-old boy and to learn how to extend self-compassion. So again, I point that out because of the assumptions we have to be careful that we're making and always looking at all three. The other person I want to introduce you to is Bill Cassay. I met Bill about 5 years ago at the Opus Peace Institute for Soul Injury. And some of what we do when we are looking at integrating scattered pieces of self and learning how to re-own those pieces and learning how to abide and reckon with these pieces that have been hurt and kind of compartmentalized off. These pieces of self often become silenced into unconsciousness. So what we sometimes do is we will use like a Gestalt therapeutic, very simple, straightforward therapeutic letter writing technique. You all have read about those in my books. I write extensively about this because I've used it extensively to help people at the end of life. But I just want to read to you, Bill is a Vietnam veteran, and I want to read to you the letter that he wrote to his 12-year-old self. And I'm going to warn you ahead of time that there is some sexual violence in this. But what I want you to realize is that Bill, as a 70-year-old man, or late 60s, I believe, when he wrote this, was writing this to his 12-year-old self. So I'm just going to read to you what he wrote. Dear Bill, I know you remember that summer when my 12-year-old soul was fractured every week for 3 months. It started when the door closed behind my little brother and me while a 17-year-old boy pulled out a knife and told us he would kill us if we told what he was about to do. At that age, I didn't even know what rape was. The feelings I've held in my body, I have pushed them out, and I am taking a huge risk in naming them today. That summer day that began with so much curiosity, fun, and innocence was changed into cold terror, suffocating horror, unimaginable pain, feelings of dirt and shame, overwhelming helplessness, violated safety, and rage. Rage so big that for years afterward, I plotted how I would kill him if I ever saw him again. And fear that I would do it. All of the feelings, too many and too much for an innocent 12-year-old kid to carry. Sincerely, Billy. Now, I actually have tears as I read this. I so well remember the transformation that I witnessed in Bill. And again, the assumptions, Bill's a really big guy, Vietnam veteran, and the assumptions that we make about what trauma people hold. But Bill is on the line, and Bill, I'm gonna let you speak to say whatever you might want to say about the relevance of soul injury in your life and what has happened for you.
Well, thanks, Deborah. Like you, it still brings emotion, but getting in touch with that pain and really looking at what happened to me and what's happened to me since then has been transformational in my life. And the liberation that came from my experience at Opus Peace really did transform things for me. And there's nothing that I need to hide any longer. I don't mind my name being given, don't mind my story being told. And I'm glad that I have an opportunity to just maybe touch someone else's life through my experience. So this has been a great thing for me. I've become an ambassador for Opus Peace. I've incorporated it into my own work, both in hospice and in my private practice, and it's been transformational. So,
thank you, Bill. So Bill is a chaplain as well, bereavement counselor, and so Bill, we just so appreciate your story. So glad you don't feel like you have to hide it anymore. So thank you for your courage today and sharing it with others.
Thank you.
So I'm just gonna, I'm not gonna go over the symptoms. I just want you to know on the chart that you will receive when you download, I have symptoms up there so you can do the comparison. And the treatment you just heard, the reason I wanted Bill's story told specifically was that you can see just very simple treatments such as integrative letter-writing can have profound effects when we're bringing this pain out of the unconscious and just allowing it to sit side by side with consciousness. So I'm going to actually close it as a way of a summary at Opus Peace. We kind of use 3 statements as how we operate and the services that we try to extend to others about soul injury, and it's this: cultivate in me the willingness to reown, rehome, and revitalize scattered pieces of myself so wholeness can be restored. Grow in me the honesty, courage, and humility to release my fear of who I am and who I am not. Fuel me with your grace. So I'm going to close with a slideshow. It is a slideshow that we made specifically for the pandemic. Have that available on our website. I'll make it available to NHPCO as well. I would encourage you to use it with your staff, use it with your bereavement, your people who are bereaved, use it with your actively dying families, patients that can't get into inpatient facilities to see their loved one. But at any rate, I will play it right now.
Sometimes I'm in pain and I try to explain how I feel. I know that you love me, you want to help me to heal. When my heart is aching, my love like I'm breaking in two. So you try to fix me, but that's not what I need from you. I need a witness, just need you to listen while I open up my heart. I need to tell you what I'm feeling. It's my soul that I'm revealing, so I don't need a lecture or a plan. I need a witness. Please don't run away when I'm trying to say what's inside. it's my soul that I'm revealing. So I don't need an action or a plan. I need a witness. I need a witness. I need a witness. Oh, I need a
So again, that video is available to you, and we give that with our sincere hope that you will use it to help people come to peace with all of the unpeace, the unrest that is in our world right now. So just resources, feel free to go on our website. Again, this video is on our website. You can click on it right on the front page. We do have an Institute for Soul Injury Training if you want to learn how to bring the soul injury message to other people. We offer individual memberships, and that has a large library of resources available to you. We have corporate memberships where you can really use the soul injury tools. We have a whole body of, once you take the assessment and do the soul injury inventory, we have a whole program of what to do, how to intervene appropriately after that. And again, books and DVDs. So with that, that's all that I have to say. I know that that was a lot, but I appreciate your time, your attention, and your willingness to be with me during this time together, as it's certainly a strain on all of us. So any questions or comments or concerns?
Deborah, this is Kathy. We're getting a lot of wonderful comments on the chat box about your presentation and the video that you just shared, and a lot of thanks, heartfelt thanks from a lot of folks who attended. We also got a question: how do we differentiate between psychological emotional abuse and soul injury?
Well, you can be traumatized, you can be abused, but if it does not separate you from your sense of self, then you would not necessarily have a soul injury. So the whole definition, a lot of times, and we've run into that where people will think, well, people that have PTSD automatically have a soul injury. And I say, no. In fact, our president emeritus of Opus Peace is a Vietnam veteran, and she has PTSD, and she will say, she said, I do not have a soul injury. And she says, I grew up in such a loving family that gave me such a strong sense of myself. She says that not even Vietnam could squeeze me out of me. So So again, that's, and think about my little Lassie story that I told. I mean, it's really a pretty innocuous story. I did not have a traumatic childhood, and I wasn't neglected or abused. But just that little incident of how I interpreted it, I mean, by no stretch of the imagination can that be considered traumatic. And yet it caused significant deadening within myself as I pretended that I was never sad, and I was ashamed of that part of myself. So again, the whole thing with soul injury is that it separates you from your own sense of self. You lose some aspect of your identity.
Thank you for that clarification. We continue to get a lot of thanks and messaging from folks on the chat box about the power of the presentation. So we just are so very grateful that you were willing to share your time with us this afternoon, Deborah. And I do encourage people to check out the website, all the resources that are there and the programs that they offer. And we hope that many of you will come back and join us in 2 months, and June 16th at 1 o'clock for our next Education Research and Academics My NHPCO Community Chat. And Becca, do you have anything you need to say to close us out?
Just want to remind everyone that the recording of this chat, as well as the slides and the handouts that were mentioned, will be on the My NHPCO website in the Education Research Academics Community Library. The recording should be posted in the next few days, and the slides and handouts are there now. So thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Deborah, and thank you, Bill. And I think that's it.
Well, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Keep up the good work. Take care.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.